Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video of History of podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Candida Moss. Candida read theology as an undergraduate at Oxford before moving to the United States to pursue postgraduate work in biblical studies, first at Yale University School and later Yale Graduate School. In 2008, she moved to the University of Notre Dame to teach classes in the departments of theology, classics, and history before coming to Birmingham in 2017. In which she became a professor at the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham. She is also a research associate at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. And today's topic centers around her book titled The Myth of Persecution. To purchase her book, please check the links in the description below this video. And with that being said, welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Moss.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for coming on. So I'd like to start us off with, how does one distinguish between a historical persecution of early Christians and mythical persecution of early Christians?
Right, that's a really good question. And the first thing you need a definition of what persecution is. And if I was a sociologist, if I worked for the UN, if we were talking about persecution today, then we would be talking about any time particular sets of behaviors are being singled out rather than just sort of identity. But for the purposes of my book, the definition I was working with was the idea, which is dearly cherished by many Christians today, that Roman authorities were sort of deliberately seeking out. They were targeting Christians just because of their religious beliefs. So that was sort of the definition of persecution that I was working with. And then the question was, what's the evidence? How do you distinguish between sort of fact and fiction, what happened and what didn't? And this is hard because I think everyone knows you can't prove a negative. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say this didn't happen as much as you thought it did. And I was really helped out by the fact that for the last 500 years, religious scholars themselves have been engaged in this project. So after the Reformation, there was a movement on the part of a particular subset of Jesuit priests who said, we've really got to look at the hagiography, at some of the saints' lives, these martyrdom stories, and get the clear frauds out of the mix. Luther kind of has a point. And that organization, as it came to be formed, the Société des Volontés, which exists to this day, had that exact mission. We need to sort of sort out the historical chaff, historical fact from the sort of mythical chaff. So a lot of this work had actually been done before I came to it. But even so, there was this sort of understanding in contemporary society, and there's a kind of sort of scholarly lethargy around it. And so we were still talking about periods of persecution that sort of recent archaeological data had shown clearly was not about Christians. And so, for example, once we discovered copies of the documents that people had to sign when Decius, the Emperor Decius, in the middle of the 3rd century, passed an edict saying everyone has to sacrifice, which just means put some incense in a flame, to my genius, people used to think that was about Christians. But once we saw the documents being signed by Egyptian priestesses and things like that, we knew, well, this is for everyone. And we realized that there's nothing about that edict or the documents people were signing that was about Christians. And so in order to figure this out, you have to go ask yourself, well, what's the historical evidence? When does it actually come from? Does it come from the period? And when you're trying to sort of prove a negative, you have to say, well, how many places would I expect to find this mentioned? What is the actual evidence? And for some things, that's quite difficult. And for other things, it's remarkably easy.
So did the persecutions under Nero, Domitian, Decius, and Diocletian occur?
Diocletian? Absolutely. The Great Persecution, as it's called. It definitely took place. I want to say I very much appreciate your beverage choice here. It definitely took place. Did it take place in the sort ways that it's described? No, it was passed from 303 to 305. It took place throughout the Roman Empire. So far as we know, and our sources are biased, no one died in France or Britain. And the persecution was most intense in the Greek East. There are reasons why our sources tell us this, but we're really talking about a maximum of 10 years, but mostly 2 years. And it was only the last of Diocletian's edicts that actually affected everyone. One of his edicts was an amnesty. So it wasn't what people thought, but that's the first time we can talk about widespread persecution. Decius, moving backwards, Decius wasn't targeting Christians. He wanted unity in the empire. He had good political reasons for wanting this. There had been a swift succession of Roman emperors, and Decius wanted to sort of rally the troops, get everyone behind him. He didn't want to end up assassinated the way his predecessors had been. In the end, that might have actually happened to him. So he had this period where he wanted a display of unity. It lasted about a month, and that was it. It would have disproportionately affected Christians, but most Christians just stayed home. No one came to get you to check if you were participating in this display of unity. Only one member of your household had to do it. And this is true in Diocletian's period too. People would send their brother-in-law who was a pagan as their legal proxy. They would send an enslaved worker as their legal proxy. There were all kinds of legal loopholes to get out of participating. Domitian, I don't see any historical evidence for Domitian persecuting Christians. The best evidence there, the best data, is Revelation. Revelation doesn't really have great evidence for people being dead. It has exaggerated predictions about what's about to happen that some people still think is a timetable for the end of the world. But in terms of how many people are dead, and I don't mean to minimize the deaths of 2 or 3 people, according to the letters at the beginning of the work, it's 1 person. And later on, we hear about the 2 prophets dead in the street. This is nothing like what people are claiming happened under either Domitian or Nero. And what's fascinating is when you look at other Christian texts, you look at, say, First Clement, which is supposedly written by Clement of Rome. That text, written around 90 to 100 CE, it doesn't mention anything like persecution. It says that the apostles Peter and Paul, that they were executed as the result of jealousy. And the word for jealousy there usually means kind of intracommunal jealousy. So reading between the lines, what happened here? Members of this community of Jesus followers seem to be in disarray. Some of them appear to be jealous of the status of Peter and Paul and have betrayed them to authorities for whatever particular crimes they've allegedly committed. If you were to look at apocryphal stories about why they were executed, you would have to conclude that they were executed for being annoying, for preaching celibacy, for getting in the way of the marriages of some very powerful people. And that's why they end up dying. Not so much for being Christians per se, but I would grant that that isn't nice or good. But again, First Clement doesn't describe anything like the kind of mythical persecution that people have in their heads. As for Nero, that whole story about Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Well, Nero wasn't in Rome when the Great Fire took place. Nero didn't have a fiddle because the violin wouldn't be invented for hundreds of years. But let's not quibble over those mere details. What about the accusation that he, in the aftermath of the Great Fire, seized on Christians and had them dressed in the skins of wild animals, thrown to wild dogs to be ripped apart, set on fire as torches to light his private gardens at night? Those allegations come from a Roman historian called Tacitus. Tacitus is writing 50 years later. He has no personal recollection of these events. He doesn't like Nero, spends a lot of his time trash talking Nero for political reasons. And it seems like when Tacitus looks back on what happened in the middle of the 1st century, he thinks, oh, those people Nero targeted must have been Christians. And then he makes Nero seem amazingly cruel in order to show up Nero. Now, the reason I think that wasn't Christians in the first century is because Christians weren't called Christians. They were Jews who believed Jesus was the Messiah, but just Jews. They don't have a name yet. And while not having a name doesn't mean that they can't be persecuted, if they don't have a name, if they're not a distinct group, then how would a Roman emperor decide to target them for being Christians? They couldn't. It couldn't happen. It logically couldn't happen. So what might have happened, my best guess, which has been supported by historians since, most prominently Brent Shaw from Princeton, C. Hansen, and several recent articles, and some others, is that some people were probably executed in the aftermath of the Great Fire. If they were set on fire as torches, that's a standard punishment under Roman law. If you start a fire, if you're an arsonist, Roman law will see you burned alive. It's the lex talionis, the eye for an eye punishment. And that makes perfect sense to any Roman. I'm not supporting that. I'm not suggesting we set people on fire now. I'm not suggesting it wasn't cruel then. I'm just saying that's not torture. That's Roman justice. Or Roman injustice, depending on your perspective. But if any group was rounded up at that juncture because of their ethnic or religious status, it would have been Jews who Romans already didn't like because of various myths that were clearly wrong. It could not possibly have been Christians, because it wasn't until 110 that we find Roman authorities speaking to each other about, what do we do about Christians? Now, that might just be our first evidence. I'm sure some viewers are thinking, well, okay, that doesn't mean they hadn't thought about it before. But the Roman emperor and the governor who are writing to each other in the 110s, that's the Emperor Trajan and Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia Pontus, they are unaware of any clear legal precedent about what to do with Christians. And if Nero had rounded up and executed Christians 60 years earlier, Pliny and Trajan would not have been having that conversation.
And speaking of Emperor Trajan, was there a major persecution during his time, or not really?
No. So it's really interesting. Our first martyrdom stories, best guess, and let's err on the sort of traditional conservative side, begin to be written at the end of the 2nd century. Traditions for what happened under the Emperor Trajan, those are much later. Those are 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. This is a period where Christianity is in power. People really like these stories. They start writing a lot more martyrdom stories. So there are stories about the jailers of Peter and Paul converting to Christianity and winding up dying as martyrs. There's no 1st century evidence of that, or even 2nd century evidence for that. These are later stories that people enjoy because people like stories about martyrdom. Now, every once in a while, a Christian may have gotten caught up in the mechanics of Roman government. And if we're talking about someone low status, let's say an enslaved person, someone who's not a citizen, then they can very easily be sentenced to die, because it's not that hard to end up dying in the Roman Empire. If you were to compose a satirical song, you might end up being executed just for that. So we're not talking about a period in time in which it's very hard to end up being executed. But Trajan is very explicit. He said, don't seek out the Christians. Don't allow anonymous denunciations of Christians. You know, if someone ends up in your courtroom and there's a problem, and they're very stubborn and they won't display loyalty to me, then go ahead and execute them. But he's very clear, don't seek them out. And we have some evidence that held true. There's a story that the 3rd century Christian writer Tertullian, who was a lawyer who lived in North Africa, in Carthage, modern-day Tunis, tells us about what happened during the tenure of C. Arius Antoninus in Asia Minor. Apparently, a crowd of Christians show up to his home as sort of governor, and they say, "We are Christians, execute us." And he tells him, you have ropes to hang yourself by if you want to die. So even though at this juncture, there should be some legal precedent where he's supposed to put them on trial and execute them, he just executes the sort of freedom of his office and sends them away and says, you guys are crazy, just go home. I'm not going to kill you. So there's even evidence that Roman governors weren't executing people when they should have.
And when do we actually see, like, what is the earliest evidence of a real major historical persecution of Christians actually occurred?
Yeah, a real major persecution, that's going to be Diocletian. That's your real major persecution. Like, go out and find Christians, make sure that they display loyalty. That's the major persecution of that period, although it doesn't start that way. It starts with hand over your property, hand over your books, your clergy have to display loyalty. And in fact, one of the first buildings that's destroyed is a Christian church that's that catty corner across the street from an imperial palace. If Christians were being persecuted, how did they ever build a church across the street from an imperial palace? It's not subtle. We're very far from hiding in the catacombs, which didn't happen, right? I mean, you're really like thumbing your nose at the authorities. Feels like a waste of money. The Emperor Valerian in 257 to 258, he sends some letters back from the front. He's fighting the Persians. Things aren't going well. He's concerned that this might be because of the disruptive effect of Christians in the Roman Empire, that the gods are angry, that the peace of the gods has been disrupted. So he sends back 2 letters in quick succession. And basically what those letters say is, you know, if there are any Christians in the imperial Senate, the highest legislative body in the Roman Empire, then they really need to be expelled from the Senate. Also, if there are Christians in the imperial household, that's his household, then they should be exiled from the city. And so already you have Valerian saying, you know what, there are probably Christians in really powerful places and we should get rid of them from there. It's only in his second letter that he starts talking about, you know, maybe Christian leaders should have to show obedience to me. Again, we're talking about 6 months to a year. It primarily seems to have been executed in Rome. This doesn't mean that Christians wouldn't fall afoul of people elsewhere. It's just not what I learned in Sunday school, which is constant, relentless persecution. And the mere fact that Christianity survived is somehow proof of something, because that's, well, it's not true for a number of reasons, but it's also just not what happened.
Mm. Was there really an age of martyrs? And if so, how much of it is historical? How much of it is mythical?
Well, clearly I don't think there is an age of martyrs. I think there was a period of history when Christians were the political underdogs. And stunningly, the worst period in the first 4 centuries for that immediately precedes a complete sea change, and the Emperor Constantine deciding that he's going to make Christianity state religion's a little strong for what happened at first, but you know, he's going to revolutionize the fortunes of Christianity in the Roman Empire. So there's no age of martyrs. It sounds so good. I realize that age of occasional isolated incidents of legal prosecution with a small period of actual persecution at the end isn't as catchy, but it is more historically accurate.
What caused Christians to invent these martyrdom stories?
Yeah, so this is where I might sound myself. And I have to say, you can love martyrs, that you can have martyrs without there being an era of persecution. There are many people who may have died, who in their minds may have died for being Christian, and in the mind of the person who was executing, died for being common criminals who were talking about subverting the emperor. And you can have those stories, even if the martyrdom stories are a little bit exaggerated, you can still like those stories. You know, a lot of people like Homeric epic. And if there was an Achilles, the story that we have is quite different than the actual events surrounding historical Achilles. So if you love martyrdom stories, that's just fine. But the martyrdom stories themselves, when they're written down, often, bearing in mind that not many people are literate, often they're written down after a sort of a period of kind of gestation of people sharing stories. Those stories get exaggerated. Someone travels to a particular town, they hear about a martyr there, they write down a story. It's rare that someone's outright just sitting down to fabricate a legend with no sense that there might be a historical kernel. And when people tell stories like this in antiquity, they're not as obsessed as we are with the facts and just the facts. They are much more interested in conveying a message. And martyrdom stories were used to sort of prepare catechumens for Christianity, to be sort of moral paradigms for the group. People love celebrating martyrs. It's a great way to sort of get people to sort of be more invested in Christianity, because more people are going to the celebrations of martyrs' deaths than are actually showing up at church every Sunday. So there are a lot of reasons why you would want to draw out a moral to the tale, have your martyr be a sort of paradigm of virtue, an example of how to behave under pressure. There are all kinds of reasons that the stories would get inflated, that the tortures would get worse, that the dialogues would get more extended. And we actually have some stories. One of my favorite martyrs, Justin Martyr, the philosopher, the story of his death, we have 3 different versions of that story. The first one is about 1.5 pages long. The second one is about 5 pages long. And the last one is about 12 pages long. It's not that the person who produced the last one was necessarily lying. They wouldn't have seen something sort of really wrong with expanding the story or adapting it for their own period. They would see themselves as inspired. And so this is how the traditions grow, and sort of like mushrooms in the dark where people can't see them, these stories get much, much more inflated. And it's actually quite hard to crush a martyr legend, even if you want to. There was a martyr in the 12th century in France called Guinevere, who saved his master's baby from a snake and ended up, because of a sort of misunderstanding, being killed by his master, who was a knight, when the knight came home with his wife. And they thought, oh, he's killed the baby. And only afterwards, after they had killed Guinevere, realized it was a snake. I don't know how Guinevere ends up being a Christian martyr in the story, because this is really just about saving a baby. But it turns out that Guinevere is a greyhound, not a human being. And there was a shrine to him in France for hundreds of years. If this sounds really familiar to you, yes, this is the Lady and the Tramp story, just without the happy ending. And there was a shrine to Guinevere. People used to come to the shrine. They would bring their babies, hoping that Guinevere would heal their babies. This goes on for hundreds of years. A Christian monk stumbles across this and is like, what are you doing? It's a dog. You're exposing your babies. This is demonic. And he tries to shut it down. It's just very hard to shut down. People love this legend. They love dogs. People still love dogs. And so even if ecclesiastical authorities wanted to kind of temper people's zeal about martyrs and these stories, they really struggle to do so. They actually don't have as much power as we might imagine they did. And people want what they want, and they wanted martyrs.
What I already asked that. How does Jesus parallel Socrates, the deaths of Jesus and Socrates? How do they parallel each other?
Right. So when Christians start writing down martyrdom stories, the reason they do that is they have this one big martyrdom story, and that is the death of Jesus. And when you think about it, and this, by the way, is the genius of Christianity, the crucifixion should have been the end of the Jesus movement. religious leader gets rounded up, gets executed like a common criminal. Profoundly embarrassing. This should be the end of things. For most people, if your religious leader gets executed like this is a sign either that your God's very angry with you or that your God's just not that powerful. Otherwise, he would have saved you. But then Christianity has this sort of like addendum, there's a resurrection. But what it means is that you have this sort of like paradigm of sort of weakness and suffering that becomes so important for Christianity. But when you look at the version in the Gospel of Luke, you'll notice how philosophical Jesus becomes. If in Mark's version of the story, Jesus is crying in Gethsemane the night before his death, begging not to die, Luke pretty much winces at that story, is just horrified, and says, no, we're going to make him more philosophical. We're going to make him more Socratic. And the death of Socrates, which is told in various versions by two of his disciples, Plato and Xenophon, who tell slightly different versions, in that Socrates is very composed. He had the opportunity to run away, and he didn't take it. He thought it would be a bad example. There's even a mention of some kind of beverage that they have that Jesus refuses on the cross, but Socrates does not. And if Socrates is the sort of most important martyrdom story in the Greco-Roman world, then certainly, and it was, then Christians knew that story and adapted it in their telling of the death of Jesus, just as Jews adapted that story in the rewriting of the death of Eleazar in 4th Maccabees. He sounds way more philosophical in 4th Maccabees than he does in 2nd Maccabees 6. So the stories kind of, they are rewritten in light of those paradigms. And again, as moderns, we're like, oh, this isn't history. This is making stuff up. These are lies. This is just how people wrote. This is how people wrote compelling stories. They would not have blinked an eye at this kind of rewriting and sort of recharacterization. This is what people learn to do in school. So from our perspective, we can say that the Jesus of Luke's gospel, the composed Jesus of Luke's gospel, is less historically accurate, that's for sure. And we can see the literary influences and philosophical influences that really pulled on the author of that story. But we can't sort of condemn the author of Luke for deceiving us, because pretty much everyone did this.
And what are the connections between the martyrdoms of Polycarp and Jesus?
Yeah, so the martyrdom of Polycarp, this is supposed to be our first real martyrdom story. People love the story. I love the story. Polycarp was Bishop of Smyrna, Izmir in Turkey, on the coast of Turkey in the west, not the southern coast. And he was allegedly a disciple of the apostle and evangelist John, sat at his feet as a child. And the entire Polycarp martyrdom story could not be more closely modeled on Jesus. So to begin with, Polycarp leaves the city to go outside, a little bit like Jesus goes to Gethsemane, and there they both pray, Polycarp for a very long time. And then they get arrested because they're betrayed by someone. In Polycarp's case, a member of his household. In Jesus's case, by Judas. So they then get brought to trial, where they're not really listened to. They're very calm and composed. Polycarp is burned at the stake and actually stands there with his arms outstretched as if he's being crucified. The text is not subtle in that parallel. It really hits you over the head with it. There's a moment where the Spirit descends on Polycarp. There are miracles after his death. He is described as an imitator of Christ in his death. So it's all over the place. And the idea is, you want to die like Polycarp, who died like Jesus. This is the kind of death and the kind of behavior that you're supposed to emulate. Oh, there's a Herod too. Mm-hmm. He's chief of police, allegedly.
Well, there we go. What about Ignatius? Because and there's so many fake letters attributed to Ignatius. But anyway,
Yeah,
what about his
this is
martyrdom?
true. Yeah, so Ignatius of Antioch, all these letters, right? So many. So Ignatius writes this letter to the Romans in which he says at the end, and people have called him suicidal for this. He writes to the Romans and says, do not try to interfere or save me from death. And in my head, I kind of imagine the Romans being like, dude, we weren't gonna, don't worry about it. I sort of imagine that this is all his like internal monologue that he imagines they're going to do this, but they're not because they barely know the man. And he says he longs to become food for the wild beasts. And when he does, he will truly become an imitator of my Lord. Then he will truly become a disciple at the moment of death. For the past 100 years, people have called Ignatius suicidal for his longing for death. Now, that's his letter to the Romans. That's where the early evidence ends. Because the account of his actual execution is written hundreds of years later. Now, people assume that because he wrote that he ended up being thrown to the lions. But just because he says that doesn't mean that's what happens. And the actual legend doesn't come about for a couple of 100 years. So I don't really know. I do have like a stuffed figurine of Ignatius being eaten by lions, but I wouldn't call it historically accurate. And there are lots of images of Ignatius being eaten by lions, but we don't know that that's what happened. We just don't know. We don't have the data. And the story, the actual acts of Ignatius are much later.
Why is it that martyrs were said to go straight to heaven, in contrast to Paul's view of the resurrection at the end of the world?
Yeah. So sometimes people are like, well, why would you die as a martyr? And I think, oh my goodness, it's just good investing. In fact, they even say this. So both Polycarp and another bishop martyr called Fructuosus, they both say it's just an hour of suffering. I just burn in the flames for an hour now, which is actually kind of a long time. Hopefully smoke inhalation gets you first. But versus an eternity of burning. And definitely an hour of burning versus an eternity of burning. You take the hour, right? But the other side of it is you go to heaven directly. The sort of biblical basis for this is Revelation, who says that those who conquer like the Lamb, that's Jesus, get a seat on the throne of God. And so martyrs go directly to heaven when they die because the special dead do. And there was some precedent for this. You know, there's that one biblical prophet who goes up to heaven in a chariot. And then there's Enoch who walked with God and then suddenly vanishes. Presumably he's in heaven with God. There is Jesus in the Gospel of Luke says to the penitent thief who's being executed next to him that today you'll be with me in paradise, completely messing up both the timing of Jesus's resurrection and also the timing of the resurrection in general. So why do people say this? Well, it does make martyrdom better. Go to heaven now. And if you're counting, that's like 1,800 years that you have gotten to be in heaven versus just kind of lying in limbo, or I mean that figuratively, not actual limbo. Catholic Church says that doesn't exist anymore, but waiting to go to heaven. And the reason for that, the sort of doctrinal basis, is martyrdom washes away all of your sins. And if you are sinless, you go to heaven. It's just that most of us are not sinless.
And in my closing question, did early Christians, or even some later Christians, but not too much later, did any of them have any issues with these martyrdom stories? Did some like, hey, wait a second, like way before the Jesuits, way before Luther, did anyone voice concerns like there's something wrong with these stories, or not really?
Early Christians don't really voice concern about the stories. They do voice concern about the enthusiasm people have for martyrdom. So quite early, by the 3rd century, you have people saying, like, chill. it's actually harder to live a long life in service to God than to go volunteer for being beheaded. And so you have that. You have people who are like, you know what? You all need to settle down. So you have that. You don't have real concern about the stories until later. But fairly early on in Christian history, you have people concerned about the authenticity of scriptural books. It's just that martyrdom stories aren't like scripture. And so there's much less sort of need for official responses to them.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Candida.
Thank you for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.